most people think of Judaism as a very rigid and circumscribed religious structure with very little room for variety and alternatives. In fact, in many of the areas, the Torah offers a remarkably loose framework for how we should cope with some of the problems of life. The clearest example of this is in how the Torah tells us about leadership, political leadership and religious leadership. The first example, of course, we have is of Moses, who is the political leader, parallel with Aaron, who is, if you like, the religious leader. Although it's not quite that clear, because Moses has the closest relationship with God of anybody, and Aaron is confined mainly to what we would call the sanctuary and the role of public worship. Then, after Moses, Joshua carries on in this pattern of the single leader aided by the priesthood. But within the Torah itself, there are other models too. For example, in Dvarim, we have, first of all, the idea of the shofet, of the judge. Who is a judge? We know about tribal leaders. We know about the elders, the 70 elders who were drawn from each tribe to act as a kind of a government under Moses. But all of a sudden we have in Dvarim the idea of the shofet, the judge. And we know that during the period of the judges were leaders who emerged from different tribes, who rarely got all the tribes to come together. They weren't necessarily spiritually great people, but they managed to get, if you like, enough people together to fight off the opposition and to preserve some independence for a period of time. But when any one of those judges was approached about being a king, they invariably said, "No, thank you, I don't want to be a king." And throughout this period, you still had the sanctuary, the tabernacle, and the priesthood in the sanctuary. The Torah also mentions the role of the shotrim, the shoter, the police, if you like, that section of government that makes sure that the law is abided by. They aren't specifically given the role of policemen as we understand it, but modern Hebrew uses that word to describe the modern police. But the Torah also says, if you want to, you may appoint a king. It's not as though it's saying this is a good thing. On the contrary, it uses the expression, if you say you want a king to be like everybody else, then I don't mind if you do, but there are certain limitations, and the main limitations are that he shouldn't be over-concerned about women, money, and arms, and that he should always have a copy of the Torah so that he realizes that he is not above the law. Well, after the period of judges, the last judge Samuel was approached to appoint a king, and he kind of echoes the Torah by saying, this is surely not what you want. But in the end, God says, if that's what they want, so to speak, he makes a concession. It's not the ideal, but if that's what they want, let them have it. And that was the basis for the monarchy. The monarchy started with Saul. It was supposed to be hereditary, but Saul lost the right. David took over and established a new dynasty, but even so, for a very long period, there were still those who were loyal to Saul. But then the idea of hereditary monarchy became the norm in Judea, the southern kingdom. In the north, after Jeroboam was the first king, they were switching dynasties left, right, and centre, and anybody who murdered the incumbent king was likely to be the new king. It didn't have that same consistency as the house of Judah. Then, of course, after the Babylonian exile, the tribes all got mingled in and mushed in together, and so tribal leadership more or less disappeared at that particular moment, although there was still loyalty of the Judeans to the house of David and of those in the northern kingdom to the house of Joseph. After this period, we have the beginnings of a meritocracy, of the sophrim, of the scribes, and anybody could become a scribe based on your knowledge. And although the priesthood returned when the Second Temple was rebuilt, and they had the monopoly of ceremony in the temple, they were soon balanced by the men of the Great Assembly or the Sanhedrin, which was, if you like, rabbinic, and to which you managed to achieve your position on the basis of your knowledge and seniority, but moving up on your own merit rather than the accident of birth. And although it's true that throughout the next period of about 1,000 years, after the destruction of the temple, there were two roles: the role in Babylon of the exilarch, that is to say, the person representing the house of David in exile, and he was paralleled by the head of the academies. And similarly in Israel, you had the Nasi, the president, also from the house of David, but paralleled with the Av Beit Din, the head of the courts. So you had this dual role. Then, of course, after the final destruction of the Jewish community in Israel, you have the split of the Jewish people into the Sephardi and the Ashkenazi traditions, but led essentially by scholars, by the rabbis, the great rabbis. And then you have other splits that develop within the Jewish people. You had the Sadducees and the Pharisees during the Temple period. Then you had the Rabbinites against the Karaites. Then you have the mystics, the Kabbalists against the rationalists. And in more recent times, you've had this big split between the Hasidim and the Mitnagdim, between those who accept purely scholarship as the basis of leadership and those who combine that with coming from the right family, the Yichus, the Zerah Kodesh, the Holy Seed. So you can see that in terms of government, the Torah has been intentionally ambiguous, has given us lots of different models. It is almost as though it has said, you never know what circumstances you're going to face. You never know what kind of leadership is going to be the best form of leadership and the most appropriate form. And therefore you are presented with different models, different paradigms, and you have the right, the people, to choose which paradigm of leadership will represent you. Now that we no longer have this centralized authority that we can all agree on that we once had, in fact, we as individuals make choices as to whether we will be Hasidim or not, whether we will be Orthodox or modern Orthodox. Whatever it is, by and large, we choose, even though we know that we are all influenced by birth and by the society we're brought up in and by other external pressures. The other important contribution to how we look at government and how we look at politics is the important principle that Shmuel made when in Babylon 2,000 years ago, he said, Dina de Malchuta Dina, the law of the land is the law. In other words, what he was saying is, we can have a dual system. We can have a system whereby you abide by Torah to how you lead your lives and your spiritual lives, but you may have to accept the law of the Persian Empire, the Roman Empire, the American Empire, wherever it is that you may live, on civil matters, and maybe even on such issues as moral and ethical ones. For example, what genetic discovery decides and how much you can experiment is controlled by civil law nowadays in the world in which we live. All of this indicates that Judaism is much more flexible than one might have thought, that it allows for these varieties. People often ask whether democracy is consonant with Jewish law, and Jewish law doesn't say yes or no. There are plenty of examples of democracy in the narrow sense that people have a say in government, whether these people are the wealthy or the influential or the members of a city or members of a group, whatever it is. There are examples throughout Jewish history of people having a say in how they are led. Now, my conclusion from all this is that because we can have different forms of government in different countries, in different situations, therefore it is very much a matter of choice. And therefore we should be able to express our opinions, and we should be proactive. And we cannot say Judaism approves of capitalism and approves of Marxism or approves of socialism or approves of one or the other, because in the end what it approves of is how we behave as individuals. But circumstances require different solutions, and we are able to select that form of government that we feel best suits the needs of the hour, and we as individuals can choose very often to move and to live in societies that we feel have most in common with the values that matter to us and the values of Torah.